Can you tell us about your thesis, work on your thesis, how that developed?
Yeah. I was working on homology of loop spaces, basically, which was then slowly becoming a big subject of interest. Serre's thesis and some of his other papers had really done a lot about that and skimmed the cream off the top, and then it became a question of really going deeper into it. And Moore gave me a paper of Kudo Noraki, which defined homology operations in loop spaces and mod 2. And the operations would be defined, if you had an nth loop space, you could define n operations. Now this was in contrast to the Steenrod operations in cohomology, where they were all there. But Kudo Noraki defined the mod 2 very much like Steenrod's first definition of cup I products and so on, and enabled them to calculate the homology mod 2 of iterated loop spaces of the sphere. And so it's a very beautiful paper, but it was done with the old-fashioned Steenrod approach. And so Moore suggested I put it into Steenrod's more modern approach. And that wasn't hard to do. And then I proved some other little theorems about loop spaces, like loop spaces of finite dimensional H spaces. I proved the obvious theorem. And then Moore gave me this fantastic idea of an algebraic machine involving Lie algebras and so on that would calculate a lot of homology of loop spaces. And he asked me if I could work it out. So, well, I didn't do too well working it out. I couldn't get too excited about it, probably because it was his idea, and I felt what was my contribution? And it really inhibited my work on it. And then, just before I went to Rochester, he found out that the idea wouldn't work. And so I didn't have that thesis. It would have been a great thesis, but it wouldn't have been much mine. The fantastic idea would have been his, but it didn't work. So I went to Rochester with no thesis, no degree, and they noticed. They noticed at Rochester. They were not happy. They were not happy. All right. So I felt a little uncomfortable about that. But then I discovered that Cornell had been ready to make me an offer to rescue me from my plight at not getting the offer from Rochester. And then when I accepted Rochester, they stopped and didn't make me the offer. But they were willing to do it again. So, and they made me an offer. There I was with no thesis or anything, and they made me an offer of instructorship. And I felt so much better that I sat down and wrote a thesis. And it was very interesting because I sat down, I said, my gosh, it's a pity to go another year without a thesis. I'll just sit down and write everything I can about what I've been doing. And so I wrote up my version of the Kudo Noraki operations, and I suddenly noticed in the middle of this, when I wrote it up in this more equivariant way, that there was another operation there with all coefficients corresponded to commutator products in the first loop space. And in the nth loop space, you had something which was a manifold suspension of a commutator product. And so that enabled me to generalize their work, Kudo Noraki's work, to arbitrary suspension, but all mod 2. And then, inspired by a paper of Moore about the second loop space, the other half of my thesis, I managed to prove a cockamamie theorem about the homology of n-fold loop space of an M sphere with coefficients mod p, provided p was, I think n was less than p, some crazy theorem like that. But it was quite an elaborate algebraic argument. And that half I never published, but the other half I published. And so that was my thesis.
One point which, while I was your graduate student, and I remember you always emphasized about writing clearly, writing out what you knew, and what you're mentioning here seems part of that kind of philosophy.
Exactly.
I want to elaborate on that.
It taught me that the writing can be part of the research. that you'll see things in the writing that you won't see but just thinking about it abstractly. And without actually formally writing it down, you might miss something. And so that was a very instructive experience. And
Steenrod was very intense about that theme, that writing it down was part of the process of clarification.
and writing it down well.
Yeah.
What was the statement? Write it so that 10 years later you can read it and understand it
You
yourself.
can understand it yourself, right?